Okay, I suggest we kick off as the time has reached the beginning of our webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. My name is Irem, and I will moderate today's webinar, Solidarity in Action, Trade Unions with Indigenous Workers, Examples from Australia. We are very lucky to have with us today the Deputy General Secretary of International Trade Union Confederation, Jordania Urenia Lora, and the President of Australian Council of Trade Unions, Michelle O'Neill, with us to set the scene before we move on to our panel with brilliant trade union activists. But before giving them the word, some housekeeping. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you would see a globe which would say interpretation, or potentially this might be hiding in the more button with 3 dots. But you would see this globe, and if you press on that, you will have the options of Spanish, English, and French to choose from for interpretation. And the chat function is not working. However, you can use the Q&A function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through that, we encourage you to share your own experiences, insights, and also post questions. We will have a few minutes at the end of the panel, hopefully to return to our speakers. But without further ado, not to steal the time from our valuable speakers, I pass the word first to Jordania and then to Michelle. Jordania, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irene. I will speak in Spanish. Okay. Perfecto. Bien, saludos compañeros y compañeras. De verdad que es un honor poder estar en este evento virtual, y quisiera comenzar agradeciendo, por supuesto, a nuestro equipo que ha trabajado por realizar este evento, ha trabajado bastante, y a nuestros compañeros y compañeras del Consejo Australiano de Sindicatos, a nuestra queridísima compañera presidenta Michelle O'Neill, que sabemos que también ha incidido bastante y ha colocado siempre este tema, la importancia de seguir hablando sobre los temas de los derechos de los trabajadores y las trabajadoras indígenas. A nuestros ponentes también agradecerles muchísimo ser parte de este importante debate, porque para nosotros y nosotras que hablamos de democracia, que hablamos de justicia social, que hablamos de un nuevo contrato social, es sumamente importante accionar en solidaridad con trabajadores y trabajadoras que no han tenido tantas oportunidades, y entre ellos los trabajadores y trabajadoras indígenas. La idea es que podamos seguir accionando para que la población de trabajadores y trabajadoras indígenas se les escuche, pero también que tengan la propia representación y que puedan ser parte de puestos de liderazgo dentro de nuestro movimiento sindical. La realidad, como sabemos, es que se enfrentan diversos problemas, diversas situaciones en el mundo que nos preocupa sumamente mucho. Los pueblos indígenas se concentran de una manera desproporcionada en el trabajo informal y precario, se enfrentan a niveles de pobreza significativa, y bueno, siguen sufriendo brechas salariales, brechas, bueno, laborales, todo lo que vemos en el mundo sindical que adolecemos los trabajadores y las trabajadoras. Pues esto también de una manera muy fuerte les impacta a los trabajadores y las trabajadoras indígenas. Entonces, el tema de las desigualdades, de las condiciones también de vida que tienen, y frente incluso a crecimientos económicos de los diferentes países, pues es totalmente desproporcional. Por eso muchas comunidades indígenas se enfrentan a barreras estructurales que les impiden acceder a un trabajo digno, a la protección social y a la justicia económica. Pues estos problemas son síntomas de lo mismo que hablábamos al principio, de las desigualdades de la que estamos viviendo pues en este mundo y que siguen aumentando y siguen excluyendo a trabajadores y trabajadoras de las oportunidades que se merecen. Por eso los derechos de las trabajadoras y los trabajadores indígenas son cruciales, son fundamentales dentro del movimiento sindical. Nos competen como movimiento sindical seguir luchando en este contexto porque son, como decía al principio, una cuestión de democracia y de justicia social. Entonces, compañeros y compañeras, decirles que nosotros desde acá, desde la CCI, nos tomamos en serio el tema de la inclusión, nos tomamos en serio el tema de la igualdad para los trabajadores y las trabajadoras indígenas para que puedan acceder a empleos dignos en lugares de trabajo, ¿no? En sus lugares de trabajo, para que también la identidad cultural y los derechos se respeten dentro de los lugares de los trabajos a los trabajadores y las trabajadoras en las instituciones y que puedan tener también voz en los espacios sindicales, pero no solo las voces, sino que sean parte de los procesos de las negociaciones y de las políticas públicas que debatimos a lo interno del movimiento sindical. Aunque hoy nos encontramos enfocados en el tema de Australia, las lecciones que podamos intercambiar son globales. En todas las regiones los sindicatos enfrentan retos para garantizar los derechos a los indígenas y a los grupos históricamente excluidos. Y algunos derechos que se han logrado ya conseguir han sido incluso han intentado pues lacerarlos y ponerles un ejemplo bien sencillo. Vivimos en el Brasil, en la región de las Américas, el intento del gobierno de Bolsonaro por revertir el impacto del convenio 169 sobre la población indígena. Y vemos estos ataques que se dan y se repiten constantemente. Por eso esperamos que en este seminario podamos servir de inspiración para accionar y emprender acciones prácticas que fomenten la articulación y la colaboración para reforzar estos intercambios internacionales y que podamos seguir construyendo un movimiento sindical que sea cada vez más fuerte, pero sobre todo que refleje la diversidad, la dignidad y las aspiraciones de todos los trabajadores y las trabajadoras, incluyendo las poblaciones indígenas. Así que muchísimas gracias, compañeros y compañeras, por estar y estaré atenta, muy atenta a los intercambios y los aportes de este debate.
Thank you very much, Jordania. I directly pass to Michelle for her opening remarks. Thank you so much, Michelle. The word is yours.
Thanks very much, Ryan and Jordania, and welcome everybody. So good to see you all here. I'm very proud to be able to spend a couple of minutes just explaining to you why you have such an exciting and important panel that you're going to hear from tonight. And I want to start by doing something that for those of you who have been in Australia will have heard us do before, which is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on tonight. And I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people, and I pay all my respects to elders past and present. And it always was, and it always will be Aboriginal land. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Australian Union movement and our history in terms of Indigenous workers. And our movement has a long history of standing alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers in campaigns for justice and equality and self-determination. And increasingly, these campaigns are led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers themselves. And some of the speakers you're going to hear from today are leading these important industrial, social and economic justice campaigns in our country with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members at the helm of these struggles. And with the exception of myself, everyone you're going to hear from are members of the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Committee. And that includes the chair of the committee, Jo Kerr, who you'll hear from, who sits on the ACTU executive. So this committee has a really important part to play in the leadership of our whole movement. And while the issues of all these struggles and campaigns are diverse, they've got really common themes. They're about the rights of Indigenous people at work, They're about recognition, about respect, and about self-determination. And really importantly, they're about collective action. And while we rightly are proud that some of the most courageous and epic struggles of Australian workers have been of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers fighting for wage justice, against discrimination and racist conditions, and for land rights, we also are really proud of the fact that some of our movement's fiercest campaigners and warriors in the past and today, including the people you're going to hear from, are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander union leaders. And throughout our history of colonisation, there's been staunch union allies who've stood shoulder to shoulder with Indigenous First Nations comrades many, many times. But there's also been, and we describe this as our truth-telling, there's also been within our union movement resistance to change, racist responses, and entrenched exclusion, which is why we are here and why we want to share with you what we have been doing to try and confront the necessary changes and challenges we have in our own movement, and to tell you that we have a commitment to ensuring that Indigenous people are recognised and respected in our campaigns, in our movement, as leaders of our movement in Australia, but we're also committed to that happening globally. We know that our union movement internationally will be a stronger, more effective, powerful movement if we rightly recognise the importance of Indigenous people to our movement and our struggles and our campaigns and our understanding ourselves of what we need to confront in terms of racism and exclusion within our movement. So I just wanted to make those few opening statements because it's not me that you need to hear from tonight, but it is my very great honour to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Indigenous leaders of our movement that you'll hear tonight. Thanks very much, Erin.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for brilliantly setting the scene for our panel. Also to highlight the need also to within our movement how to challenge exclusion and ensure that Indigenous workers have their rightful place within the unions as representatives, as leaders, and as activists. So the point is definitely taken, and this is why also we're organizing this event to bring the experience from Australia, and I very much hope we will be able to do more of these kind of webinars and meetings where we can share experiences also from other parts of the world with one another, and hopefully grow this work. But now to our 5 amazing speakers. As Michelle have said, they're all also themselves from Indigenous and First Nations communities in Australia. They are all very well-known and important activists, trade union activists in Australia. And when I come to each one of them one by one, I will introduce them before they take the floor. Just as a reminder to them, they will all have 7 minutes each, and I will, when we are coming closer to the last 1 minute, I will turn on my microphone to remind you there's 1 minute left. So I apologize in advance for the interruption. Now, our first speaker is Lara Watson. Lara, who is a Biri Gabba woman. She is the Indigenous officer at the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the First Nation Workers Alliance. She has been particularly working to ensure First Nation communities in remote Australia have access to secure, meaningful employment that strengthens both local economies and cultural connection. In this context, she, for example, helped run a campaign on the punitive nature of the former Community Development Program in Australia, and instead advocated for reforms that respect the autonomy, cultural obligations, and fair conditions for Indigenous workers. Lara has also played an important role in shaping discussions around Australia's remote jobs and economic development program, pushing for models that prioritize real jobs, proper wages, and community-led decision-making. Laura, I mentioned the punitive nature of the former community development program. Would you please tell us how unions challenged these schemes and advocated for decent jobs and fair wages for First Nation workers? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, can I please honour the Yagara peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I join you today. I pay my deepest respects to their elders past and present, whose strength, resilience and wisdom continue to guide future generations, and to all First Nations people joining us from different countries and communities across the world. I extend my respect and gratitude for your presence here today. So the Community Development Program, which is actually known as CDP, was effectively a work for the dole scheme in remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, where more than 80% of participants were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So in Australia, we provide an income support payment for people who are looking for work. The payment is relatively low and is intended to help cover basic living costs such as food and rent and household bills. A Work for the Dole program is where participants undertake community-based projects through non-for-profit and community organisations for that income support. It is supposed to help build skills, gain experience and improve people's job readiness. But on CDP, people were being put into waged jobs in the private sector and they weren't getting paid a wage. They were only receiving that income support, meaning the private sector had a free source of labour and participants did not receive the same workplace rights and protections as other workers. And that includes award wages and just standard employment conditions. The scheme relied on punitive penalties and compliance measures, which could leave people without income for 8 weeks at a time. Majority of participants had their rent and bills automatically deducted from their income support. So if they weren't paid, neither was their rent or their bills. Unions, we actually come out and we argued that the program was racist because remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers were being treated differently from other Work for the Dole participants in the rest of Australia, and that it was discriminatory because they were treated differently from all other Australian workers. We organised key CDP workers and spoke out about the unfair treatment and the impacts it was having on participants and the communities that they lived in. We used real life and lived experiences. We established the First Nations Workers Alliance to give CDP workers a collective voice. It operated like a union for CDP workers, but since then it has grown into a much bigger alliance for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander working rights. We ran the wage justice campaign, arguing that people doing real work deserve real wages. We delivered training in remote communities to CDP workers, so they had the tools to run the wage justice campaign themselves in a culturally appropriate way. We amplified workers' stories nationally and challenged the idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be paid a proper wage for their work, and they should be under the same workplace conditions. We pushed governments to replace the punitive employment policies with community-led solutions and secure jobs. After years of campaigning and consultation, it was actually an ALP government that accepted that the CDP had failed remote communities. And it was that government that went out and actually consulted in remote communities and asked them what should replace the CDP, the Community Development Program. They established a reference group that only included Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders, which included the First Nation Workers Alliance, and that was to help guide employment programs and to tackle employment issues that our communities face. This helped design the Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program, which is known as RGED, that is now in place and being rolled out. So the RGED program was designed around real jobs with real wages and proper conditions. RGED jobs are paid at an award or a minimum wage rate, and it includes superannuation, it includes annual leave and workplace rights, something that the CDP never had and never even had the inkling of having. RGED jobs are meant to respond to community priorities and be developed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. What CDP was more of a free source of labour for private enterprise, which an employment program should never be. RGED jobs RGED jobs are meant to be respond to community priorities and have that development and co-design aspect with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities rather than being imposed from a country's capital city. I've got 1 minute, have I? RGED shows what can happen when workers organise, when unions stand in solidarity and community-led solutions are adopted. What CDP did was treat Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as welfare recipients who should work for benefits, but because unions took up a fight, RGED now recognises us as workers who deserve what all workers deserve: real jobs, real wages, real rights, and a real say in decisions that affect our communities. And I would like to finish by saying that while unions don't always get it right, sometimes they need to be challenged to live up to their own values. And as First Nations people, we might be a minority in our own country, but the union movement is built on solidarity and justice. Solidarity doesn't mean choosing which worker deserves support. It means standing with all workers. And sometimes it's up to us to remind our unions and to help lead them back to those values. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and perfectly on time as well, and with such a great message of the need for solidarity and this push. But I hear also from the example you have given how important it was to ensure that Aboriginal workers, First Nation workers themselves were right from the beginning initiators, instigators, and leaders of this campaign. It sounds like this was one of the key things that made it successful to overcome the problematic CDP and replace it with RGED, as you said. Thank you so much. Now I directly turn to our next speaker, Maria Tapim from the Australian Services Union. She's a Torres Strait Islander leader, and she's coming from a family with a strong legacy of Indigenous rights advocacy, and she continues that tradition through her own work. Currently serving as cultural practice program coordinator for Torres and Cape Hospital and Health Service, Maria has more than 27 years of union experience and represents Torres Strait Islander workers at state and national levels. She's the co-chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Annual Conference and deputy chair of Torres Strait Traditional Languages Association, and a leading advocate for ensuring Torres Strait voices are reflected in union campaigns and broader social justice movements. Most recently, she has played an important role in bringing climate justice issues affecting Torres Strait communities into the trade union agenda. Maria, you have been involved with the Our Islands, Our Homes campaign that seeks to protect the low-lying Torres Strait Islands from the impacts of climate change while defending the rights, culture, and homelands of Torres Strait Islander peoples. What were the key messages of the campaign towards the union and broadly, and what role can unions play in advocating for climate change that protects communities, jobs, and cultural heritage? The floor is yours, Maria. You also have 7 minutes, and I will remind you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome from the Torres Strait Islands. Firstly, I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners in which I am calling from today, the Kaurareg Nation here in the Torres Strait Islands, their elders past, present, and emerging. Just a bit of background about Torres Strait Islanders. We are the second Indigenous race in Australia. As Lara mentioned, First Nations are minority, but for us Torres Strait Islanders, we are a minority within the minority. So just a bit of background about the Torres Strait Islands. The Torres Strait is a shallow 150 wide continental shelf passage between Australia and Papua New Guinea. And it contains over 270 complex islands, but only 17 inhabited. There are a lot of our islands that are up above, that have hills, but the most low-lying island is just 1 meter above sea level. So what we have been experiencing for the last 20 years or more is the rising tides, which are wiping out a lot of our homeland. One thing that we just really don't want to be or end up in is being refugees in our own country. If we have to leave our islands, which we have lived there for generations, for over 60,000 years, to live in mainland Australia, we feel that we will become refugees in our own country. We have 2 campaigns that are happening in the Torres Straits at the moment. One is called Our Islands, Our Home campaign. It's made up of 8 Torres Strait Islands from the central group of Torres Straits. They live on low-lying Coral Cay Islands. They have witnessed a lot of erosion, but also erosion of the remains of their loved ones. So burial sites have been washed away onto the reef. They've had to collect all these bones and bury them again. So just an idea of what's happening up here. We see it frontline, the impact of climate change because of our islands, tiny islands. And they have been campaigning since 2022. They made legal history after United Nations High Human Rights Committee found that the Australian government is violating its human rights obligations to Torres Strait Islanders by failing to act on climate change. So with that, Australian government's response was a Band-Aid solution, we feel. It hasn't been taken, they haven't been taken it seriously enough. They've built seawalls that are half done Seawalls don't go around the whole island. So even though it's in front where the community is, we're getting the tides from the back. There's a lot of things happening. We see seawalls as being a Band-Aid solution, and also, it's not working if you're just doing it, partly. So there's a lot of problems happening even with the seawalls. We have a second campaign called the Australian Climate Case, which is two campaigners from the islands of Buigu and Saibai, which are much north and closer to Papua New Guinea. And this campaign, they've taken the Australian government to court, and the response that they got back was from the judge was that they feel that they don't have any responsibility towards a duty of care to Torres Strait Islanders. We feel that that's a racist and a judgment from them. And we that campaign actually made an appeal, which failed, and they had their second appeal last week, and now they're waiting on a response back from, and it'll take about 6 months. So at the moment, we're on hold at the moment to see what response the Australian government comes back with for the second appeal. And we find, as being Indigenous, that we always have to fight harder to get what we want. If there's a bushfire near a city, the government's there straight away. But whereas for us, it takes us extra to fight to get something done. So I personally had thought that for my share is to because I work with the union, to table this at union at a national level to see what the union can do to support climate justice. And what we're actually fighting for is that we need to start reducing gas emissions by transitioning to renewable energy. And we have to do that globally for it to assist us, especially for us on the islands. Saibai Island has been given 30 years to move, or the islands will be underwater. 30 years is not long. It's created, mental instability, especially with our elders who worry about what's going to happen to their islands for their children and their grandchildren. So it's an ongoing struggle for us to save that island. And you have a lot of islanders that feel that if our islands go underwater, so will we, because we do not want to move. We are connected to those islands. Our ancestors.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Our ancestors have lived there for generations, and we will not leave there. If we do leave, we will be disconnected. Like I said, what we need to do now is reduce gas emissions globally. So I'm asking the unions here in Australia and around the world to help us advocate for transitioning to renewable energy. So at least we have a chance of saving our islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Did I touch?
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, it's it's such an issue, but for some people, it may seem so remote, and you help bring it to home what it means actually when climate change is having such dire impact, forcing communities to rebury their loved ones or fear losing their homes. You mentioned 30 years for some islands to disappear, but until then, I understand many livelihoods are also being impacted. Ways of lives is already being impacted, and at ITUC also, we call for a just transition to greener economies where both workers in all parts of the world can have safe conditions to live in safe climate along with decent jobs. So thank you for bringing that perspective. And you also discussed, how the Torres Islander people have been using both strategic litigation cases, be it at UN Human Rights Council or at in Australia, along with campaigning to be effective. But of course, we hear the need that this is a global issue. All the unions across the world have to be joining forces to deal with it. Thank you once again. Now I move to our third speaker, Wayne Cornorth, who is a Larrakia man and a committed union leader with the United Workers Union. Wayne is known for his strong advocacy on behalf of Aboriginal workers in some of Australia's most remote communities. Drawing on deep cultural knowledge and lived experience, he has played a key role in organizing and empowering remote Aboriginal workers, ensuring that their voices are heard in national industrial conversations and that their work is recognized as essential. Wayne has also been a leading figure in United Workers Union's Culture Doesn't Clock Off campaign, which seeks to embed respect for cultural obligations such as kinship responsibilities within the national employment standards. Wayne, why is it important to reflect cultural and kinship obligations in workplace rights and national employment standards? How does the Culture Doesn't Clock Off campaign push for the recognition of these rights? Over to you, Wayne. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging my ancestors, the Larrakia people in the Northern Territory, up in the city of Darwin area. I'd also like to acknowledge all of my comrades and, online with your mobs where you're from, and acknowledge everybody that's attending this today, because this is an important, meeting, catch up to discuss or to share what we're doing, the work that we're doing, which is so important to keep fighting the fight that we need to keep on the front foot, keep pushing forward on. So, yeah, I'm the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organiser for United Workers Union in the Northern Territory. We focus on a lot of basically over 60 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities throughout the remote of the Northern Territory, predominantly all mob that live in communities. When I mean mob, I mean by our First Nations. Why we look at a campaign around Culture Doesn't Clock Off is to identify and push the two worlds. So one world is to work and pay the bills and that side of things. The other side is your cultural obligations to mob that have to do ceremonies, that have to do like women's business, men's business, certain like young boys becoming men ceremonies. There's a lot of different sort of ceremonies that sort of happen, not just in the Northern Territory, across Australia, and it's hard when you're employed, but then you're also having to commit to do ceremonies and stuff with your mob, with your people, which can affect your employment, or which it's just about finding that flexibility through the two worlds and finding that place in the middle where there's that flexibility to be able to still do your cultural obligations, but you still have a job and you still got bills to pay, and that side of it to survive as well. When a good example is one of my team that I work with. He is a ceremony man, from the West Arnhem Land region in the Northern Territory. He's been taught and handed down his song lines, in particular with certain particular ceremonies that he has to conduct when they do stuff like sorry business. So when I say sorry business, it means like when someone passes away and they go through that ceremony to lay that person to rest. And sometimes that could take a couple of weeks. Sometimes in the interior, there's the dry and wet season. A lot of ceremonies around sorry business happens in the dry season because it's too wet to get all of your other family, your other kinship networks across the other communities to come to help be a part of that ceremony as well. So, him employed with United Workers Union, it's a great example of how our union sort of pushes the at least 10 days paid cultural and ceremonial leave, which gives him a little bit of flexibility, even though he probably needs some more at times because he's relied on to do a lot of ceremonies at times. But basically, to give that little bit of flexibility so that way he can go back out bush, back in to the homelands and perform his ceremonies. So, obviously with cultural obligations, if you're a key person to bring it within that family group, that clan group, to help be a part of that ceremony, and if you're not there to perform it, it could bring shame upon your family group. So it's not just you as an individual, it's your clan group as well. So it's your clan group, your kinship sort of group as well. So that's why it's important when you're looking at the two worlds, cultural obligations, and then obviously just the basic of holding a job, earning your pay and paying the rent. How we got about doing it, we sort of, within our union, United Workers Union, we have over 150,000 members across Australia. We formed an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander national roundtable within the union. And through that leadership group there within that union we identified the work, I identified with my team, identified that we need to try and do something about finding that middle ground. So we pushed the agendas through that national roundtable, who took that on and supported that. And then through that national roundtable, through our union, we tabled it. We had conversations at last year's ACTU Congress, which gained more momentum and support behind it. It got up as it got put up as a motion and supported by the union movement. And then we pushed it to the next level. So within the Labor Party, who's in government at the moment, through the National Indigenous Labour Network, which supported it there. And just not, I think last week, the week before, they had the Labor Party National Conference, and that got put up and pushed the agenda through there to have it on as a platform to lobby our government now to push this through so it's recognised as an employment standard. Sorry, I've sort of...
No, thank you very much, Wayne. It's very helpful also to, recognize all these issues that, responsibilities that, Aboriginal and Torres Island workers would have, and how to bring, as you said, the two worlds together without, I suppose, ensuring that these rights are enshrined in, workplace agreements, in collective bargaining, or at national level through legislation. Without a systematic change, then workers are forced either to choose their cultural obligations or a livelihood, their work. Yeah, I think it's very helpful. You gave these examples and explained to us the important work you're doing. Thank you so much, Wayne. Now, moving on to our fourth speakers, Dr. Charlene Leroy-Dyer, a Awabakal and Darug woman. She's a prominent union leader within the National Territory Education Union and is widely recognized for her advocacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff working in Australia's higher education sector. She has been instrumental in advancing the recognition of cultural load within university enterprise agreements, which is work that reflects that additional cultural responsibilities, community engagement, mentoring, and emotional labor undertaken by Indigenous staff, which is similar to also the work that Wayne was describing to us. And Dr. Leroy-Dyer has played a key role in negotiating this work, the cultural load, formally to be acknowledged and importantly remunerated, pushing universities to move beyond symbolic recognition toward tangible and paid provisions. Charlene, can you explain to us what Indigenous cultural load entails and how can unions and employers better recognize and address it? Over to you, Charlene.
You and Warami, everyone. That's hello in my language, the Darug language. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the country where I am, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and just extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples joining us in this seminar. Unlike the three speakers before me, I don't work for a union. I'm a grassroots delegate and leader. I work in a university and I'm an associate professor and director of the Indigenous Business Hub at the University of Queensland. But I've been involved in the Australian trade union movement for more than 45 years. I currently chair the National Tertiary Education Union's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Policy Committee and represent the NTEU on the ACTU Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Committee. My work focuses on employment, leadership and organisational change. And tonight I'd like to talk about one issue that's increasingly affecting Indigenous workers across Australia, and I suspect many Indigenous and First Nations workers around the world. So I want to begin with a simple question. What happens when an organisation becomes more committed to Indigenous inclusion but doesn't change how the work is organised? The answer is something we rarely measure, rarely acknowledge, and almost never reward. We create Indigenous cultural load. Indigenous cultural load is the additional cultural, emotional, and relational work of Indigenous employees just because they are Indigenous, not because it appears in their job description. Many Indigenous workers become cultural advisors, mentors, educators, community connectors, and translators between cultures. They are asked to sit on diversity committees, advise on organisational policy, support Indigenous staff and students, explain cultural protocols, respond to racism, and maintain relationships with community. None of this work is unimportant. In fact, much of it is really essential. Many of us undertake it willingly because we care deeply about our communities and because we want to create better workplaces for the next generation. The problem is not the work. The problem is the expectation that it is for free. One of the most important things I've learned through my research is that Indigenous cultural load is not created by Indigenous peoples. It's created by organisational systems. When organisations employ one or two Indigenous staff members but expect them to carry responsibilities for reconciliation, cultural safety, community engagement, and Indigenous inclusion, they create Indigenous cultural load. They have become more committed to inclusion, but have not recognised or redesigned the work. The additional responsibilities are rarely reflected in workload models, performance expectations, promotion criteria, or staffing levels. As a result, Indigenous employees often end up doing two jobs: the one they are employed to do, and the cultural work the organisation has failed to properly resource. So why should trade unions care about this? Because trade unions have always fought to make invisible labour visible. We've fought for recognition of unpaid overtime, emotional labour, psychological health and safety, insecure work, and fair workloads. Indigenous cultural load belongs in the same conversation. It represents additional work, additional responsibility, additional emotional labour without additional time, recognition, remuneration, or support. That's not simply a diversity issue, it's a workplace issue. And because it's a workplace issue, it's also a union issue. So how do we begin to address it? For employers, the first step is recognising that cultural work is work. Indigenous employees are mentoring staff, advising on cultural matters, building relationships, supporting organisational change, and that work needs to be recognised, allocated time, and appropriately valued. It should be reflected in workload models, performance reviews, career progression, and not treated as voluntary or goodwill. Second, organisations need to stop assuming that Indigenous inclusion is solely the responsibility of Indigenous employees. Creating culturally safe workplaces is everyone's responsibilities. For unions, there's an important role that we play. We can advocate for Indigenous cultural load to be recognised in our enterprise bargaining and in our modern awards systems. This is something that we have done within the NTEU, and 75% of our enterprise agreements within the higher education sector in Australia now have cultural load recognised in their enterprise agreements. We can ensure it's considered in workloads, psychological health and safety discussions. We can support Indigenous members who are carrying these invisible responsibilities. And we can continue to amplify voices in our workplaces and our union movements. I'll leave you with one final thought. Indigenous peoples will continue to mentor, educate, advocate, and build relationships because that's who we are. We do this work because we care deeply about our communities and because we want those who come after us to have better opportunities than we did. But inclusion should never depend on unpaid labour of Indigenous peoples. If we're serious about equity, then Indigenous cultural load must be recognised, shared, and properly valued. Around the world, trade unions have fought to make invisible work visible. Recognising Indigenous cultural load is simply the next step in that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. And also thanks a lot for all this great work. It's, as you said, I mean, this is clearly a workplace issue. It's clearly a trade union issue that needs to be dealt as such. And as you said, you know, it shouldn't be considered as a voluntary goodwill contribution from the side of the, you know, Indigenous workers, but recognized, valued, also in terms of time and pay, and properly recognized. Thanks so much again for raising this issue and also sharing, the great work, great coverage in collective bargaining agreements you have reached for the workers and workplaces that your union represents. So thanks a lot. Now I move on to our last but not least speaker, Joe Kerr. Joe is a long-standing Aboriginal union leader and activist with the Community and Public Sector Union, where she serves as section secretary for Indigenous peoples organizations. She has been a prominent advocate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers' rights and leadership within the public sector. With decades of experience across government and community roles, she has been actively involved in advancing employment pathways, cultural competency, and equity for First Nations workers. She also plays a key leadership role in the broader union movement as chair of the ACTU, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Committee, as Michelle mentioned at the beginning, contributing to national policy discussions and representing Indigenous union members at the highest levels of the ACTU. Joe, now you also have 7 minutes. Can you, during that time, please give us some examples of, enterprise agreements you have won so far, and how, some tips you think have contributed to them, to achieving them. Thank you. You are still muted.
That's handy. I worked that one out. It's a COVID thing or a post-COVID thing. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Cabral clan of the Darug Nation in southwestern Sydney. I'd like to thank the custodians of the lands, the waters and the skies that we're living on and meeting on today, and thank them for their continuous custodianship of those lands. I'm apologising, I didn't get the memo about the background. So I've got a different background to everybody else, but anyway, that's okay. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about from a CPSU's perspective. For many years, the CPSU has advocated and won rights and conditions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees in the Australian Public Service. I too, like Charlene, I'm a rank and file member of the CPSU, so I have a day job. I work for the Australian government. Actually, I've probably got 2 day jobs because, I think I probably work as much for the union as what I do for the government sometimes, but don't tell them. Anyway, getting back to the story. From the mid-1990s, my union, the CPSU, took claims to the Industrial Relations Commission, or what was called the Industrial Relations Commission then, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees to be able to access leave to attend NAIDOC celebrations. And for those people online who don't know what NAIDOC is, that's a week of celebrations that showcases Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, and it's held in July every year in Australia. So we won that. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees in the APS have had NAIDOC leave for a considerable amount of time. And then we also took on other significant conditions on behalf of Aboriginal workers, such as recognising kinship, improvements to NAIDOC leave, ceremonial leave, recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language skills, recognition of connection to country, and cultural leave. So I'll tell you a little bit more about some of those conditions. Wayne spoke about the Uwu campaign that's currently running called Culture Doesn't Clock Off, that his union, as I said, is currently running, which seeks to embed kinship responsibilities within the national employment standards. We applaud that. From our perspective, we've had kinship and the definition of family for many years in some agencies. in my agency, as I work for an Aboriginal agency in the Australian Public Service. I currently work for the National Indigenous Australians Agency, but I've had many years in the Australian Public Service, and I originally worked for an organisation called ATSIC. Now, ATSIC was around when the current government decided that we would have agency bargaining or enterprise bargaining in the country, so in the early 90s. And so from then, I've had kinship in the definition of family in the agency that I've worked at. And so in 2024, we bargained for the first time since probably 2015 when we had an award. We bargained across the entire Australian Public Service, and we won kinship in the definition of family for 104 Australian government agencies. So there's 104 Australian government agencies now that has the definition of kinship, I must say, in their definition of family, the word kinship. And what that means is that our extended family is actually acknowledged in our immediate family, which is really important as an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander person, because we are connected so much to our extended family and our kin. So that's really, really important to us. So some of the other things, I think I'll probably touch on NAIDOC leave. I mentioned that we've had it since the early 90s. So we currently have it for only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees in the Australian Public Service. We're back at the table for whole of service bargaining again. And one of the things that we're taking to the table this time is to extend that to enable non-Indigenous Australians to celebrate that week with us and to learn from us. To learn about our histories and our culture and our achievements over time. And that will assist in the truth-telling process of our country as well, so that people actually can celebrate and showcase our achievements of who we are as peoples, as the oldest living culture in the world. So that's an important thing to us. I mentioned cultural leave, and I'll touch that last. We also won in the last bargain ceremonial leave, and it's a type of leave that's specifically only available for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees. It could include some of the things that Wayne was talking about in terms of ceremonies, ceremonies for births, for initiation, for deaths, and other sacred ceremonies. It's a positive workplace experience that should be acknowledged and accepted, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have cultures and customs and obligations, and the introduction of ceremonial leave recognises that obligation and commitment to kin and country that's unique to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees across the APS. So we've secured 6 days over 2 years, so which really means it's 3 days per year, but it's over 6 days full pay for ceremonial activities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees across the Australian government. For our cultural leave, in our enterprise agreements, employees can access cultural leave to participate in significant cultural and religious obligations associated with their faith or their culture. This leave's not specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait not specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees, but it creates greater cultural awareness and understanding. That is the foundation that will enable us to design inclusive workplace processes, to enhance workplace relationships, to improve cultural safety and improve communications, decision-making and policy, and service delivery across the APS. And by actually having cultural leave for all employees, it assists them in fostering a more inclusive and respectful Australian public service, and helps people to be retained in the service. So that's just a few of the things that we've done across the entire APS. but most of the things that we've advocated on have been advocated by and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I think probably what I'll say now and what happens now in the movement more so than before is we get to make the decisions that impact on us, and that really people now believe that there should be nothing without us, nothing about us without us, and that's how we want to maintain it. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Joe, and a great message you ended with. Nothing without about us without us. I was just with the examples you were giving, I was just thinking, you know, how it would have been impossible to think about those needs and those, you know, challenges to incorporate them into, you know, as be it ceremonial leave or, you know, cultural leave, or description, you know, ensuring that family includes kinship, you know, this extended family. This wouldn't have come and properly addressed if Indigenous workers, Torres Islanders and First Nation workers weren't actually pushing for this and leading this work. So again, it shows the importance of your message. Nothing without us, about us without us. So thank you very much for finishing on that note. I see quite a few messages in the Q&A, but I also see it seems many of them are answered already, which is really great. Thank you so much. But I'm just looking at you. I see Laura's hand. Maybe you want to touch upon some of them. And if you see, yeah.
Sorry, I've just been answering them from, I guess, a peak body perspective, but others may want to answer some of the questions that have been asked. I just didn't want anyone asking a question and having it left unread.
We can't see them anymore, Lara.
No, if you go to answered, you'll be able to see the questions.
I would suggest, Laura, because you've read all of them, if you have suggestions to read out loud, maybe a couple to pose to other panelists, that would be greatly helpful.
Okay. Yes, because there's been some great ones. Let me read one out then. As someone working with trade unions across the Asia Pacific, I'd like to ask a broader question that I think many of us are reflecting on. Looking back, what were some of the key turning points that enabled ACTU and its affiliates to move beyond supporting First Nations peoples and workers to making First Nations leadership an integral part of the Australian trade union movement?
Any of our panelists would like to reflect on this? I'm looking, you know, I don't want to put anyone on this. Oh, I see Joe's hand. Please, Joe, you go ahead.
Yeah, well, I put my hand up because I think I've been around the longest, you see. So I could talk about the struggle to get to what we've got now from where we were. Now I've just forgot what the question was. No, I think probably why is it happening now is because we did struggle for so many years to get what we've got. We ended up with having a long time ago, we had the ACTU established an affirmative measures role on the ACTU executive, and that was in 1997. So once we got those roles there, and we had an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander committee at that stage, but then when we had a coalition government, the committee fell away a little bit because the union had other fights to fight, which was to get rid of that government and also stay established because they were just union busting. The coalition government was just wanting to get rid of unions across the country. So we had the committee established. And so the committee has worked together effectively on all of the campaigns that Lara mentioned. Like you've got Wayne now running the campaign on Culture Doesn't Clock Off. So I think it was because we've got structures within the movement is one of the main reasons why we've been able to do stuff. Individual unions have structures as well. The ACTU has one. And the person asked the question, they're from across Oceania or the Asia Pacific. I've just been to the Public Services International Oceania meeting last week. It was our first inaugural Indigenous Workers Forum. We had an Indigenous Workers Caucus the day before that. So it's establishing structures in unions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers or Indigenous workers that make the change.
Thank you very much. That really clarifies, and also in all the examples, these structures within unions were mentioned as taking leadership and leading on the issue. So it's definitely brings home this important aspect and the need to have concrete structures to ensure that it's not just sometimes an issue that comes up, but there is a structure that leads on it and brings to all the discussions these important issues. We don't have huge amount of time. I'm looking at Lara in case you think there was a really pressing question to read out loud as well. If not, I will, yeah.
No, all the questions were great, but the answers will take longer than what we've got. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I mean, maybe we can collect those answers and send them to the participants as well. And I hope they were able to read while we were discussing also some of those responses. I mean, I want to turn to you all. I know we will, Jordania will make closing remarks now, but I also want to thank you all from my side for, it's late time over there, for giving us your time, your experience, sharing all these important work that you are carrying out. And I'm very much sure that this is an inspiration for many workers and unions across the world. This will be available on ITUC YouTube channel as well. So we will be sharing broadly for everyone to see and hear and be encouraged to do also similar work. Without further ado, I turn to Jordania for closing remarks. Also, thanks to our interpreters. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Irene. Y de verdad, compañeros y compañeras, que ha sido sumamente enriquecedor este intercambio, el poder escuchar de una manera tan contundente que desde el movimiento sindical y otras organizaciones se está trabajando y luchando para que nuestro mundo sea cada vez más inclusivo y que trabajadores y trabajadoras indígenas puedan ejercer sus liderazgos, puedan ser escuchados y que sus derechos pues les sean respetados. Hemos escuchado ejemplos sumamente inspiradores, pero no solamente ejemplos, prácticas también, iniciativas y sobre todo conquistas interesantísimas que pueden servir a otras partes del mundo donde también la comunidad indígena pues está siendo sometida a diferentes complicaciones, a diferentes situaciones. Es decir, que esto puede servir ciertamente a otros pueblos, a otros países que también tienen comunidades indígenas adoleciendo de diferentes problemas. Es importante seguir visibilizando este tipo de iniciativas, de campañas que ustedes han estado haciendo y seguir visibilizando cuál es la realidad y la situación de la población indígena y que debemos seguir trabajando como sindicatos, planteando que es necesario construir un sistema que genere empleos dignos y salarios justos para todos y todas, sin dejar a nadie atrás, como hemos dicho muchas veces. Y bueno, ciertamente es importante mencionar el tema de la justicia climática. Ya Irene hablaba de que desde el movimiento sindical internacional luchamos por una transición justa, y cuando hablamos de transición justa también mencionamos estas inquietudes de espacios y economías más sostenibles que no impacten al medio ambiente, a los trabajadores, a la gente. También hablamos desde ahí. Y lo otro es importante mencionar lo que hemos escuchado de ustedes, de que no se debe obligar a los trabajadores y a las trabajadoras a elegir entre sus empleos y sus responsabilidades culturales. Para nosotros eso es un punto sumamente importante a resaltar. También las conquistas a través de las negociaciones colectivas, que pueden ir mucho más allá de los reconocimientos simbólicos, y que se puedan garantizar realmente los derechos y las protecciones que merecen en sus lugares de trabajo las personas indígenas, los trabajadores y trabajadoras indígenas. Para concluir, decirles que este debate ha puesto de manifiesto la importancia de la solidaridad internacional. Creemos que es una base, creemos que es parte central para seguir luchando. El compartir estas experiencias desde Australia es sumamente valiosa para ustedes, pero también, como decía al principio, para todo el mundo, para todos y todas. Todos los países deben captar lo que se ha logrado desde Australia, las luchas que se llevan desde Australia, y poder constituir este bloque de todos y todas, pues en pos del respeto a los derechos y a los principios del trabajo, ¿no? El respeto, la representación, la dignidad y la justicia social. Sigamos, compañeros y compañeras, nuestra lucha, ampliando más, visibilizando más este tipo de situaciones en nombre de la democracia, asegurándonos que los pueblos indígenas sean también participantes de nuestro movimiento sindical, pero también de la construcción de salidas a las diferentes situaciones que estamos librando en el mundo. Nuestro compromiso debe llevarnos a ampliar, a seguir trabajando en conjunto, para que en conjunto logremos pues más conquistas para todos y todas, que no sea solamente el intercambio de experiencia, que nos sirve muchísimo, pero que también podamos materializar y promover los derechos de los trabajadores y las trabajadoras indígenas a través de una acción colectiva. Y en nombre de nuestra Confederación Sindical Internacional, ha sido un honor, y repito, ha sido enriquecedor este debate, y agradecerles a nuestros ponentes, a nuestros panelistas por los puntos que han colocado, por los aportes, agradecerles a nuestros participantes, a nuestro equipo del Departamento de Igualdad, a Irem, a Carmen, que está por ahí también apoyándonos, y por supuesto a los trabajadores y las trabajadoras de la interpretación. La solidaridad sigue siendo nuestra mayor fortaleza, compañeros y compañeras, y sin duda estamos juntos y juntas. Muchas gracias.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.